Diana Johnson MP. Let's start at the beginning. Did you have a happy childhood?
I had a very happy childhood. My family weren't political at all, so politics didn't feature in my childhood. My mum and dad voted, but that was about it. But I had a great time. I had 2 older brothers. I was well loved. My dad was an electrician, my mum was a housewife. I had a great childhood looking back. Sadly, my mother died when I was 16, so my teenage years were a bit difficult, but on the whole, yeah, I had a great loving family and I was really lucky.
Your mum died when you were 16?
Yeah, she had cancer. And it was really tough, actually, Gloria. I still get upset now, and I'm 55 now, but it was really tough losing my mum when I was 16. And, at that time, there wasn't a hospice locally, so she died in the local hospital. And, yeah, it was tough. It was really tough. But my family, really supported me and, my 2 big brothers and my dad. But it was tough. And I think any young person who loses a parent, it's that starkness, isn't it, about mortality. And when you're in your teens, it's particularly hard to lose a mum, as it is at any age, of course.
Did you have counselling?
No. I mean, this was back in 1983, and I was doing my A-levels, and I had a really kind of rough time. I didn't do very well in my mocks. I remember that. I did really badly in my mocks, and I'd wanted to go to university. I wanted to become a lawyer, and it was a bit of a struggle, actually. But then when I did my exams in the summer of 84, it was fine, actually. I passed, I got my grades, I was okay. But it was a bit of a difficult time, and I think something like that stays with you throughout your life. And what's interesting, I always think, is you see a lot of politicians, actually, who've lost parents either as a child or a teenager. And I think there is something in that it kind of makes you think very long and hard about your life and what you want to achieve and what you want to do with it, perhaps much sooner than perhaps people whose parents are with them until much later in their lives.
And you're a breast cancer survivor?
Yes, I am a breast cancer survivor. I had my first mammogram at 50 and I had no indication there was anything wrong, thought it was all fine, had the mammogram, and then I got called back. And I was incredibly lucky, actually, because there was no lump, nothing. And they treated me very quickly. It was a stage 1, it was very small. I only had to have radiotherapy, not chemotherapy. So I feel incredibly blessed that I was caught so early on. And I say to women now, go and get the mammogram because it can save your life. I just feel very fortunate that I was part of that screening programme and was able to get the treatment to sort me out. And here I am 5 years on, larger than life and feeling well.
You have the fortune of having served in government. It's a fortune that I never had as a Labour MP. You were a whip. And there's quite a lot of chats about, the operations of the whips at the moment. What happens, or did you have experience of when you had to push through a vote and actually the position was very, very difficult to get MPs, Labour MPs at that time, to vote in line with what the government, the executive of that Labour government had asked you to push through?
Yeah, there were certainly times when it was tough. I was a whip under Gordon Brown, and obviously then during that period, we had the expenses scandal. That was really very difficult. But also we had legislation going through that sometimes Labour MPs didn't want to vote for. There was legislation around Heathrow and the expansion of Heathrow. So certainly you had to be very mindful and treat MPs as grown-ups. And if they really had a problem with a particular piece of legislation, I would never have threatened or said, you don't do this, X, Y and Z is going to happen to you. You try and talk to people, treat them as a grown-up, talk to the minister, get the minister to talk to them, and at the end of the day, get the Prime Minister to speak to them if it's something that's absolutely essential and their vote is required. So there are ways of treating people, and I have been shocked in the last week or so to hear some of the direct threats to members of Parliament. And the other key thing is that it's not just about that one vote, because you're going to have to rely on those people in the future. And so building relationships is a really important part of being a whip. And if you go in heavy on people, it can very often backfire. And in the future, when you might need them for something else, they may well not do what you want them to do or ask them to do. So there's quite a lot of psychology, I think, in the whip's office. It's not like how it used to be, you know, when it was brute force and holding people up against the wall and all of that. That certainly wasn't my experience, but it may be, perhaps, the whip's office is resorting to that again.
When one is in opposition, it's difficult to change things because obviously there's more people in the government, on the government benches than there are on the opposition benches, which you have been on for 13 years. You have been a campaigner though, and you have achieved change on infected blood. Just explain that, explain why you campaigned on it and what you achieved.
You're absolutely right. Opposition is tough because you can't personally get to do very much. You have to rely on colleagues across the chamber, Conservative MPs and others, to really help you make your case. And a good example of this was the infected blood issue. So this was the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Haemophiliacs, people who needed blood transfusions, perhaps in childbirth, some of them were given what's called dirty blood. And they contracted then hepatitis and HIV, and some sadly got AIDS. So it was a big issue. There were thousands of people affected. However, for various reasons, it never got the traction that it deserved. And various governments, including my own Labour governments, didn't really ever deal with this and tackle what had happened and how the lives of these people had been affected. So in 2010, one of my constituents turned up at a surgery and said to me, I'd had dental treatment, I needed a blood transfusion, and I was given dirty blood and I contracted hepatitis C. Will you help me? Will you help campaign to find out how that happened and for proper compensation? Because there's never been compensation paid to these people. And I said, yeah, of course I will. So I got involved with the all-party group, cross-party, and we campaigned for years. We got David Cameron to actually finally issue an apology in about 2015. But we never got the public inquiry, and it was only in 2017 when Theresa May had lost or had just won the election, but she didn't have a majority, and she was trying to do deals with the DUP. And at that point, we got all the opposition leaders to sign a letter to Theresa May to say that they were going to call a vote. They were going to have a vote in Parliament about the infected blood scandal. And I think that really freaked out the Prime Minister, actually, because the DUP had signed that, and it would meant that she would lose any vote in Parliament. And John Bercow, as Speaker, was really helpful. We had various procedures we could do in the House to try and force this along. To cut a long story short, I received a telephone call telling me that Downing Street were going to announce a public inquiry, which people have been campaigning for 30, 40 years. So that was a huge tribute, really, to the campaigners over all those years, but using Parliament and using the House of Commons and using MPs from across the chamber to actually get justice, we hope, for a group who for so many years had been overlooked.
And it's interesting that how that case came to you was via a constituency surgery.
Yes, and I think MPs find, don't they, that the big issues that they take up often come from a constituent sitting down and saying, I need your help and this is what's happened to me.
The question is, are they safe in their current form? I'm going to put it out there, I don't think they are.
Are they
constituency surgeries? They're not safe in its existing form, and I don't know if any more evidence is needed to demonstrate that.
I think you've got to you're absolutely right there, actually. I mean, I've stopped doing face-to-face surgeries. I've been doing Zoom surgeries and telephone surgeries throughout COVID, and I thought this autumn I would go back to face-to-face, but I've decided not to. I'm going to wait until the new year. I've always asked for people's name and address before they come. I have done surgeries when I've stood in McDonald's or a shopping centre and anyone's been able to speak to me. But I think you're absolutely right. Now, I am nervous about that, and I shouldn't be, but I do feel nervous.
What's the answer? Is it to provide a police presence for MPs at those surgeries? Although that would freak some constituents out. It's really difficult to know what the answer is.
It would, because in your surgeries you will know. You know, I've I'm just thinking back, I had a woman who came to me because she'd had a terrible experience reporting a rape to the police. Now, if the police were there somehow in the room or outside the room, that may well have been something that that woman wouldn't want to talk to me about. So I don't think having the police there is the answer. I think what I've learnt over the last 16 years is that there's a coarsening in the debate in this country, and it's become acceptable to be rude, aggressive, obnoxious, when really you are entitled to have your view, I'm entitled to have my view. We can disagree, but we can do that agreeably. And I think the threats, particularly women MPs get on social media, that's a big issue.
You talked about cross-party working, and you are now chair of the all-party parliamentary group on women's health, the chair of the APPG on sexual and reproductive health. Why? What are you campaigning on now?
Well, there's a few issues in that, actually. I mean, we've done a recent report on access to contraception. We found that actually access to contraception has reduced over the last few years, not just during COVID, but before, because of the fragmentation of budgets and responsibility for providing contraceptive services. We've had cuts to public health budgets, and public health is responsible for sexual health in communities. So that's another problem. And we've also been looking at abortion and abortion services and whether the current law is actually right for 2021. Of course, the abortion law came in 1967, a great landmark piece of legislation, but medical advances over the last 50-odd years mean that that act is now very out of date and needs to be reformed. But it's a very contentious issue, and governments don't normally want to touch anything around abortion because it's a free vote. So we've certainly got views about what we think should happen around abortion. We think certainly it shouldn't be, it's based on the criminal law, and we think that's wrong. It's based on a Victorian statute where it says if a woman tries to procure her own miscarriage or someone helps her, they can end up going to prison for life. So the 1967 Act set out very specific conditions when an abortion can be carried out. So it has to be with two doctors, it has to be in a clinic, and there are various other conditions that have to be met. But if you don't meet those conditions, then you could be liable under the Criminal Act that I just referred to. So we think that's the wrong way of doing things now. It should be taken out of the criminal law. It should be seen as a health matter between a woman and her doctor. Of course, it should be regulated and there should be proper provision around the regulation, but it should not be a criminal matter. So things like that, as an MP, we pass laws, but then over time, those laws may well be out of date, and I think it's my job as an MP to point this out and say why the law should be changed.
We were both MPs when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. Lots of people, undoubtedly, particularly young people, liked Jeremy Corbyn. But the Labour Party at that point was in civil war. There is no doubt about it. It was a very difficult period for anybody involved in the Labour Party of whatever wing of the Labour Party they were from. There was a campaign for all Labour MPs to undergo a reselection process by their party members. A lot of time was spent trying to prevent that. We wasted arguably a lot of time stopping those attempts to get rid of Labour MPs, and made the argument that surely the effort should be on getting rid of Tory MPs. You were one of only 2 Labour MPs who went through a full reselection in 2019. How was that?
Oh, it was awful. And I've been an MP since 2005, so I've been through reselections before, but this was particularly awful. And the key thing for me was the rules had been changed, so a minority of members of the party could force the majority of members of the party to have to go through a full open selection. And you're absolutely right, Gloria. I was reselected, I think, on the Friday night, and the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, called the general election for the December 2019 on the following Monday or Tuesday. So there was a weekend between me being reselected, having spent the previous 3-4 months focusing solely on the number of members in my constituency, not knocking on the doors and talking to the electorate, but focusing in on that much smaller number to get them to to vote for me at an open reselection. And overwhelmingly, it was 3/4 of the vote at the reselection voted for me to carry on. So I certainly have no problem with going through reselections in every parliament. That's absolutely the right thing to do. But the rules that were brought in by Jeremy Corbyn and his group really were not about democracy. That was about trying to bring in people of the same ideological ilk as Jeremy. And actually the Labour Party, as you know, is a broad party. We're a coalition, actually, aren't we? There's more on the right and then the centre and there's some on the left, and we come together and we agree on various policies. But to try and remove MPs, sitting MPs, I just think at that time, you know, our focus needed to be on the electorate and certainly not on the internal machinations of the Labour Party. So it was a really horrible time to go through, actually. And I'm just glad that my members voted for me and I carried on. And it was really ironic because I think the year before I'd been voted Backbencher of the Year for the work I'd done on the infected blood scandal. And so it was really, it was really unpleasant.
Finally, to go back to where we started, your dad was an electrician, your mum was a housewife. Does there need to be more members of Parliament with stories and backgrounds like that?
Yes, I think we need to have a range of people in Parliament, and certainly, you know, I don't come from a political family. In fact, my dad, I remember when I was 16, he said I was going through a phase because I joined the Labour Party, and here I am now, you know, 40 years on, still going through that phase. I think we need a variety of people, don't we? We need to have that breadth in Parliament when we make decisions. And so if you come from a very privileged background, that's fine, but it shouldn't be the majority of people in the Commons. And I feel really proud of my parents as well, because they had me when they were a bit older, and they fought in the war, and my dad was in the Navy and my mum worked in a munitions factory. And I think that instilled in me that you know, that public service and wanting to give back. So, you know, I'm really proud of my parents and my family, but I think you're absolutely right. We need more ordinary people to get involved in politics. And in fact, there are lots of ordinary people in Parliament already, but we don't often hear about them.
Well, we've heard from one today. Diana Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you.